Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm speaking to you from my studio. This morning I'm going to talk about why Rhodes must stay. I'm alluding to an issue which seems to have been forgotten for a couple of years, happily, so perhaps it's injudicious of me to broach the topic once again. It's a statue of Cecil John Rhodes in Oxford. Now, it's on the side of Oriel College. There's a statue of him high up. There's also a plaque at a different location in Oriel on the house where he used to live, saying, in this house, the Honourable Cecil John Rhodes kept academical residences, and it says the year, and blah, 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 erected by people who are mindful of the great services he performed to his country. I'm quoting it from memories. This is ipsissima verba, sorry, it's ipsissima vox rather than ipsissima verba. Who was Cecil Rhodes? Well, he was a British man who was born in the West Midlands of England. Oh my goodness, I should know the exact year. Around about 1850, and his father was a priest in the Church of England. Church of England priests are entitled to marry, by the way. So he's one of several brothers. I don't think he had any sisters. Anyway, so his father had high social status, but not that much money. So Rhodes, he went to Oxford University. But he had a health condition. I can't remember what it was. Something with his lungs, and he was told that a dry climate would suit him. The soggy British islands were not good for his condition. So he went to South Africa, where a couple of his eldest brothers had already emigrated. So South Africa was then partly British colonies, and there were partly these Afrikaner republics, as in Afrikaner meaning people of Dutch descent, whites of Dutch descent who lived there. And they were under the paramountcy of the British Empire. It was a nebulous phrase, which led to more trouble later. Anyway, so he was then involved in business. Mining was big business in South Africa. He initially simply sold things to miners like tents, tools, alcohol, whatever else they would need. And that's how he started to make his fortune. Only later did he get into mining. So he completed his degree in Oxford, but it took him about 10 years because he'd go back and forth several times, trying to spend summers in England. Even that was a strain in his health. So not to stay in England for more than 6 months at a time, go back to South Africa for a year or so, recover and return. So eventually he was awarded his degree. And he became the richest man in South Africa, one of the richest men in the world. He got into politics and he became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. South Africa, as we know it, wasn't united till about 1910, when the Union of South Africa was formed. So the majority of people in South Africa then, as now, were black, and there were some white immigrants, British people, Dutch people, a few other nationalities. But the whites were never more than 20% of the population, but they had most of the wealth, and they virtually monopolized political power for themselves. What else is he known for? Well, establishing what are now called Zambia and Zimbabwe. So he encouraged Britishers to sign treaties with indigenous kings. One of the famous examples is King Lobengula of the Matabele people. That's a Zimbabwean ethnic group. They're sometimes called the Ndebele. I don't know which is the correct pronunciation. Anyhow, there was the Rudd concession. It's all about the right to mine there in what's now Zimbabwe. But then there was some dispute. It was a matter of interpretation, or perhaps more than that. Did this give this British company the right to simply minerals under the soil, or was it everything, or was it the land as a whole? And Lobengula felt that he had been duped, that it had been deliberately mistranslated for him, and so forth. Anyway, fighting broke out, and these Britishers won, and they took control of Zimbabwe. It was then named Southern Rhodesia. So the Ndebele were an ethnic minority group, but they had mastery over the majority group, who were the Shona. And some Britishers said, oh, we came there as saviors of the Shona. Now, as Shona has told me, that is not true, and thought it was a contemptible lie. Zambia later became Northern Rhodesia, as in they're named in honour of Cecil John Rhodes. Later, they had the motto, Sic nomine digna, may she be worthy of the name, as in the name of Rhodes. Now, so you can interpret that either way. Some people say, yeah, they were worthy of the name of Rhodes, but in a bad way, because he was such a monstrous person. So Don't want to go too much into Zimbabwean history, but there was fighting, so obviously people were killed. One cannot fight without that. And there was a Jameson raid in, if memory serves, 1896, when there were these Afrikaner republics, the Orange Free State, the Transvaal Republic, as I said, which were dominated by people of Dutch blood who spoke the Dutch language, or Afrikaans, as it evolved into in South Africa. And obviously the majority of people there were black, but they were excluded from political rights. So some British people had immigrated there to make the most out of what had been discovered in mines. Anyway, Dr. Jameson, who was Rhodes's personal doctor, he led a raid into these Afrikaner republics in an attempt to seize them, saying the British minority there are mistreated, wasn't too concerned about the black majority who were discriminated against by law, and that Rhodes was behind that. Anyway, the Jameson raid was a fiasco. They were defeated, blah, blah, blah. Jameson was later sent to prison in the United Kingdom. The Afrikaners didn't execute him because they thought that might inflame British opinion. So that's a little bit about Rhodes. He died in 1902, just as the Second South African War was coming to an end. I shan't get sidetracked in that. His last words were, "So much done, so much to do." He was a bit of a misogynist, it seems. They say power's an aphrodisiac. Well, he never married, never had a girlfriend, and he seemed to loathe women. Some of his friends were married. He refused to meet their wives. When he had dinner parties, he insisted they were all male dinner parties, which was unusual at the time. There was a Polish aristocrat who had the hots for him, and she chased him around Cape Town. He never wanted to meet her. Did she really fancy him, or did she want to get her grubby paws on his filthy lucre? So that was that. He may have been a repressed homosexual, which is neither good nor bad, but being anti-women is bad. So he was adulated in the United Kingdom for decades, and Oriel, his old college, remembered him fondly. He gave money, which expanded the college, and that annex, which has a statue on it, was paid for by him, as the Latin inscription declares. He also set up the Rhodes Educational Trust, setting up these Rhodes scholarships. He foresaw the possibility of war between the United Kingdom and Germany. So it's scholarships for people from all over the British Empire, not the UK though, and Germany and the United States, to study at Oxford University. And it was for men. There were women at Oxford University in those days, but very few. Now, he didn't say that you had to be of a certain race to go there. However, certain of these scholarships were only for boys who'd attended particular schools in South Africa, and some of these schools were whites-only schools, according to their own admissions policy at the time. So it might not have crossed his mind that black South Africans would go to Oxford in time, although even by the time he died, there were a few black, Indian, Chinese students at Oxford University, just very few. So when the royal family visited Zimbabwe in 1947, they went to the grave of Rhodes in a big hill. It's not been removed, even though he is abominated by most Zimbabweans, because there's a very strong ethic against disturbing the graves of the dead. So some people want the statue removed because they say Rhodes was evil, he was racist, he started these wars of aggression, things like that. He allegedly said, "I prefer land to N," N being the N word. There was a South African student, I can't remember the gentleman's name, who was campaigning a few years ago for this statue to be taken down. Rhodes Must Fall was the big campaign. But if it was so objectionable, why would you go to Oxford University in the first instance, especially on a Rhodes scholarship, where he was saying, all we're doing is bringing back some of the wealth to our country? However, Rhodes mainly made his money out of mineral resources. These minerals had laid under the soil of South Africa and Zimbabwe throughout all time, but the indigenous people had not decided to exploit them. It's only when Europeans came along, they dug them up, they had a use for them, they sold them, and they brought these countries into the world economy. Now, there was definitely a bad side to colonialism, and yes, there was fighting and people were killed. Were there massacres? Were civilians deliberately killed under Rhodes? Not so far as I'm aware of. I know considerably later in South African history there were. We all know about the atrocities at Sharpeville and Soweto, but under Rhodes, not that I know of. He was a megalomaniac, Rhodes. He wanted to unite as much of the world under British rule as possible. He had this courage of the Cape vision of British colonies all through Africa, connecting it. And he wrote his plan saying how the Holy Land must come under British dominion and so forth. He said, "Remember, you're an Englishman, have therefore won first prize in the lottery of life." So seemed to be a British supremacist, not just a white supremacist. So he had many flaws. He did give the right to some black men to vote, not women. No women in South Africa were allowed to vote when he was around. So he said it should be for civilized men, it should be on a racial basis. However, in practice, this meant that over 90% of those allowed to vote were white. But that might have expanded. These black people who had the right to vote were later deprived of that in the 1930s under apartheid. Well, even before apartheid, actually. So I think it should stay for all sorts of reasons. It's a historical monument. It's got its artistic merit. And he did do good as well as bad. I don't think anyone can say the Rhodes Trust was all bad. We've got to judge him by the standards of his time. He helped the country develop economically in commerce and technology. So that was an enormous boon. As in taking over Zimbabwe, was that outright aggression? It might be that it was. Now one could riposte, but the Matabele had done the same to the Shona only about 40 years earlier, and they did nothing in mitigation, as in they weren't bringing more advanced technology which would raise the quality of life. So I have no doubt that Rhodes was primarily self-interested. He was not an entirely benevolent person. The trouble is, we'd have to remove all statues because all these monarchs or politicians of the past have done things which we now consider to be unacceptable, presided over slavery or executing people for their religious faith, and soon our heritage would be gone. So for all these reasons, the statue of Rhodes should stay.